Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Emily Chamley-Wright, and I'm the president of the Institute for Humane Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. A special thank you to our supporters who've joined us. It's because of you that we're able to advance the ideas and principles that underlie free, prosperous, tolerant, and pluralistic societies. Now, at IHS, we believe in the power of ideas to drive widespread human flourishing. But we come to that work with a deep sense of humility. At every turn, the world issues new challenges. And that's why we need an open exchange of ideas, precisely because every generation is called upon to discover, test, and refine solutions to those fresh challenges. And I'll go one step further. Not only do we need an open exchange of ideas, we need to reconnect to the joy of intellectual exchange and discovery, which is why I am so pleased to introduce our series of crucial conversations. This series brings you some of the best and brightest minds in their field, working to identify freedom-based solutions to today's most complex challenges. The Institute for Humane Studies is building a network of high-impact scholars, policy experts, public intellectuals, and research communities that span generational divides, disciplinary divides, ideological divides, and professional divides to develop and advance the ideas that support thriving, constitutionally constrained liberal democracies. And here to introduce today's topic and guest is my friend and colleague, Jason Cannon. Jason is the Philanthropic Partnership Advisor here at IHS. And without further delay, I'll turn it over to Jason to introduce today's esteemed speaker.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Cannon, and I am thrilled to welcome you to today's conversation with Professor Ed Glaeser. We're really in for a treat today. Ed is one of the world's leading experts on cities and urban life. And today's discussion promises to really stretch how we think about the ways that cities can make us freer and more prosperous. Ed and I will talk for a little less than half an hour, after which I will be posing some of your questions to Professor Glaeser. So I'd encourage you to drop your questions into the Zoom window during our conversation. You can just click that little chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll take as many questions as we can in the time that we've got. And we really do want this to be a conversation. I know that we have a lot of supporters attending today, and we want for you to join that conversation. We also want to say thank you. Thanks for helping us keep the work of freedom alive, as Emily just mentioned, and thanks for helping us work with star academics like our guest today, Ed Glaeser. Ed is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics and the chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard University, where he has taught microeconomic theory and occasionally urban and public economics since 1992, after receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's one of the world's leading experts on how cities grow and thrive, and the role of cities as centers of idea transmission and generation. He's widely published and even more widely cited on urban economic growth, law, and economics, and you are likely to know him from one of his several books, including his most recent from 2021, Survival of the City, Mass Flourishing in an Age of Social Isolation. So, Ed, we are so thrilled to have you here today. I think it makes sense to get started by just hearing a little bit about how you came to the study of cities. What was it that piqued your interest here?
So there are at least three different ways to explain this. One of which is I grew up in New York City. I experienced this amazing arc of New York, where during the 1970s, even through the early 1980s, it really felt as if the city had lost its way. I didn't know as a kid growing up in New York that this was not at all an unusual story, that all of America's older, colder cities felt in those years as if they were headed for the trash heap of history. And then in the 1980s, there was a bit of a revival. As we later figured out, a lot of this had to do with cities' enduring ability to speed the flow of knowledge, speed the flow of information, whether or not that's on a trading floor in Manhattan, where financiers get smarter by being around other financiers, or in a market in Lusaka. But I was amazed by this arc, by the decline, by the rise. Second explanation, my father was an architectural historian. My mother ran capital markets for Mobil Oil. So what else could I be other than an economist who studies cities? Third explanation, I was at the University of Chicago in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And this was a time in which the so-called new growth theory was being developed, which very much focused on the idea that it was knowledge itself that was the crucial ingredient in growth. And knowledge that doesn't just benefit the creator of that knowledge, but everyone else who learns from it. The importance of so-called knowledge externalities or human capital externalities was being vaunted by Paul Romer, by Bob Lucas. And that led Bob Lucas back to thinking about Jane Jacobs and her work on the economy of cities. And I was a very impressionable 22-year-old sitting amidst this mess of, and what's great about it is it's knowledge spillovers at the University of Chicago about the importance of knowledge spillovers. And so it became natural for me to sort of start working on that aspect of cities, which is how I got started working on the problems.
Great. I want to come back to knowledge spillovers later on in our conversation. So, all right, you start studying this stuff in the 80s. You show up at Harvard to start teaching in the early 90s. Tell us a little bit about how cities, American cities, have evolved even since then.
Right. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, and there's a lot of heterogeneity even during the last 4 years over the COVID pandemic. So probably the thing that feels most continuous is the cities of the Sun Belt continue to do pretty well. Now, that shows up in different ways in different parts of the country. So in the southern states, it's shown up primarily in terms of population growth. So you've got lots of new houses, lots of new jobs, just from Dallas to Atlanta, to Phoenix. These places are just booming. And this reflects at least three different things. It reflects the fact that these states have been much more pro-business. These areas have been much more pro-business than their northern equivalents. So the work of Tom Holmes looks at counties that are on opposite side of state borders between states that have right-to-work laws that are relatively pro-business and states that are relatively pro-union. Going back to 1947, he sees a huge difference in the growth of manufacturing and industry in the right-to-work states relative to the non-right-to-work states. So right-to-work states are disproportionately in the South, partially because they just didn't have substantial industry in 1947, so there wasn't a union movement to have to buck. Secondly, these states also make it much easier to build. You don't understand why Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix have been adding 1 million people a decade over the last 2 decades without understanding these places make it massively easier to mass produce housing. Of course, third, and it also just reflects the fact that people don't love driving on the ice in January, right? That actually it's the weather actually does matter. Someone who has raised 3 children in New England, as someone who's raised 3 children in New England, I can say that I think it shows a lack of character on the part of America, but there's no arguing for taste. The place where the Sun Belt has arced, which is sort of important and tragic, is that LA didn't look that different from Atlanta in the 1960s and 70s in terms of its growth trajectory. And then sometime around 1973, to take a particular date, that's actually the Friends of Mammoth decision, like California basically shut down building, especially in coastal areas. And the increasing regulation that happened throughout California in the 1970s in many different ways meant that California is still relatively booming, despite often very strange local policies. But that shows up in terms of sky-high housing prices, which price out, of course, ordinary people rather than rising population. And of course, there are high incomes that go along with those rising housing prices. And I've called this the closing of the metropolitan frontier, that throughout most of America's history, we moved to productive places. Now we can't because of this. In the colder parts of the country, 2 basic stories, one of which is traditional Rust Belt cities, right, places with relatively low levels of education, started declining from deindustrialization, and they really never came back. And there are times when, insert your favorite Rust Belt city here, have had flickers of life, and then everyone gets excited about how, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, it's back, but it's never really back the way that in 2 senses. First of all, these cities are never going to come back to where they were in 1960. That's just not going to happen. And secondly, they're still fundamentally not all that economically healthy places, even if you see, some green shoots. And then there are the highly skilled cities, the New Yorks, the Bostons, which really have come back. And they came back precisely because they became capitals of the information age, that the old urban density that once served to make it easier to get barrels onto clipper ships now speeds the flow of ideas in highly lucrative, knowledge-intensive industries such as biotech and financial services.
Let's talk just a little bit about the California example. So, what is it that has been so restrictive on their growth and their ability to build? What are the policies? What are the choices that have allowed for that to happen?
So the terrible thing about land use policy is that there are 1,000 different ways to say no. And California has experimented with lots of them in different time periods, which is why this is an area where you can't just say, oh, just switch minimum lot size and that will go away, right? Because it won't, because there also are growth controls. Oh, just switch the growth controls. Well, there are also the need for an environmental impact statement on all private projects. This was what the Friends of Mammoth decision required in 1973. There was a law that clearly seems to be meant originally to apply only to government projects, that they would require an environmental impact statement. The California Supreme Court in 1973 then said, oh, well, since the government is permitting private things, all of them are government things too, and you need to do an environmental impact statement for all of them as well. So this is an enormous expense. And even if you were an environmentalist, this is a terrible policy, because from a carbon footprint perspective, building in coastal California is the best thing you could possibly do in America, because these are very Mediterranean climates. They just involve far less carbon emissions than other parts of the country. And when you say no to building in California, right, whether or not it's for environmental reasons or for other reasons, you don't say no to building in America. You just move it from an environmentally relatively mild place to a place that has a lot more heat or a lot more cold, or for whatever reason is just much worse for the environment. So the environmental consequences of California environmentalism are far from obviously positive, even if you forget about what you care about in terms of housing costs or other things. So there are, the minimum lot size numbers are extraordinary. And, there are places where in greater Silicon Valley where there are 60-acre minimum lot sizes. So there are just a lot of the free parking requirements. I go back and forth about which aspects of land use controls I hate most in a given day. Sometimes it's draconian minimum lot sizes. Sometimes it's restrictions on adding other forms of density, building up. Sometimes it's free parking requirements, the fact that you've got to build for driving when you build stuff. And then some of it's the restrictions on mixed use. In a world post-COVID, when the sort of sterile and difficult nature of the vast office parks in downtown cities have become obvious, the fact that our governments have been telling cities that they have been telling builders that they have to keep their offices away from residential areas, that just seems like shooting yourself in the foot.
So what I'm hearing is that when it comes to the ability to build, there should be interest across the political spectrum on the left and the right for the various priorities that different groups hold. Environmentalists should be on board for the carbon reasons that you just mentioned. On the right, there are tons of reasons to spur economic growth and to promote freedom. Is that right?
I think there are reasons across the board. But it's often very hard to get to yes, in part because the way these laws are enacted is very complex. So at the federal level, I've been in conversations with people at the Department of Housing and Urban Development around land use regulation since the late Clinton era. Okay, so for the last 25 years, and I have never yet encountered someone from HUD who thought the current situation is good, or who didn't want to do more to get rid of some local barriers. They may have differed in how much they wanted to do it, and few of them are as extreme as I am. But in terms of their how seriously they take freedom, but they've all wanted to do it. At the state level, there's some more enthusiasm, but it's mixed. And at the local level, outside of big cities, it's just very, very hard to get to yes, in part because every bedroom suburb in America is dominated by homeowners who don't think housing affordability is a good idea, right? Because in fact, that's reducing the value of their primary asset. And the people who would benefit most don't currently get to live in that town. They don't currently get to vote. They're the outsiders who would want to work their way in. Now, in big cities, you have more of a mixed bag, because you've got developers who typically do want to build, although they don't want their competitors to be able to build, so they can be complicated. You've got employers who definitely want more building. You've got banks who want to do lending. You've got people who represent the construction unions. So all of those people tend to be at the table at big cities, which is why sort of larger jurisdictions tend to have slightly less of a problem on this than the small bedroom suburbs. But it's very hard to get to yes. I think the political future of this involves state houses. And involves state houses sort of changing the way that the powers of local governments to restrict individual freedom.
What are the areas that are doing this really well right now? When you look across the country, where do you see some of the smartest approaches?
So in the US, as opposed to, let's say, in South Korea or Singapore, where density is a conscious choice of policy and is, there's an embrace of that. I would say most of the places that are doing it best just haven't thought about it very much. So I tend to think that, I tend to prefer the Texas cities where just the rules are very light. I don't think a lot of harm comes from that. And it's not because they, 75 years ago embraced the idea that you're going to have light touch land use controls because this is the right strategy to promote density. It's not at all what they thought. They just thought, why should we have rules that restrict what businesses are going to do with their land? And so it just, adhering to a status quo of relative freedom ended up being a very good thing. And I think, the dynamism of Texas cities tends to show that. In the places that are making incremental changes around the edges, so for example, density bonuses in Los Angeles, rules that promote assisted additional development, ADUs in Seattle or Minneapolis, I'm certainly in favor of all these. They tend to be fairly small. So they're places that have gotten themselves in a fair amount of trouble. They're making decisions around the edges, and you wouldn't say that they're, as much as I laud what they're currently doing, and I think it's great that they're doing something, but you wouldn't say this city has gotten it right. And of course, the other irony, just in terms of like remembering what this does, is because Texas's relatively pro-freedom policies have meant that it's easy to build. Texas has housing that is vastly more affordable than, let's say, Massachusetts. And it's an enduring irony that Texas, just by letting the private market work, has done so much more for affordable housing than allegedly progressive Massachusetts, which manages to dribble out a few allegedly affordable units every couple of years. So it's sort of a deep irony along the way that just the free markets can be much better for justice in many ways than a highly interventionist system.
Sure. So let's talk about economics for a little bit. And by the way, I will remind our audience that if you have questions, to drop those into the chat function in Zoom. We'll take those just shortly. So you have spent so much of your career looking at how cities drive economic growth and prosperity. What are the key factors that allow for that to be the case?
Look, I have a very simple economic development mantra, which is attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. Now, this is not actually a complete laissez-faire strategy. I often say, just as there are, no atheists in a foxhole, there are no pure libertarians in the city. And even though, I'm a student of Gary Becker's, which makes me an intellectual grandchild of Milton Friedman, and I'm, in graduate school, I certainly just probably hewed close to a libertarian line on everything. That's not where I've ended up, largely because cities need police. And there's no, it's not that I'm against the idea of public-private partnerships in terms of building highways between spaces. It's awfully hard to imagine how you're going to have a completely privately managed grid, for example. And like taking care of the grid requires a competent public sector. Most of the things in which government regulates private actors in cities, I would like less of. And I certainly think that, we should be, enthusiastic about alternative options to large, big city public school systems. But they're going to be urban functions in any case. And getting those functions right is actually part of attracting and training smart people. So getting the schooling system together is part of training, both training kids and attracting parents who want to be there, right? And I don't think it's, I have sympathies for the view that we could embrace a full Friedman voucher system, but it's so far away from the political conversation that it's it's relative to, we could do more incremental stuff around charter schools, but that's, which I certainly support. But thinking about doing things that actually fix public schools is also probably not a bad use of time. I have been spending a lot of time lately on road roughness, which so thanks to Uber, I have for a month in 2021, I have the universe of Uber drivers' cell phone motions. So all of our cell phones have accelerometers that measure how much we're bumping up and down at any point in time. That's the thing that manages to pull your phone up when you're this way or the other way when it's down. Those actually, turns out, do a great job of measuring how much a car is going up or down. So with this, I basically have measures of how rough all of our roads are. This is actually useful for many reasons, one of which is the Department of Transportation has actually been measuring highway roughness by sending drivers out at midnight for the last 40 years. And that's great for telling you about highway roughness. And it's great for also belying the American Society of Civil Engineers, which has been downgrading the level of our highways from a B- in the 1980s to a D over the last 20 years, during the same period in which actually measured roughness has actually gotten a lot smoother. So the actual hard data goes in exactly the opposite direction of the American Society of Civil Engineers grading on highways. You might even think they were an interest group lobbying for more spending on their own product. But we don't have measures on local roads. And certainly in my daily commute, like the highway's fine. It's all the other roads that are a disaster when I'm driving around Boston. So now we have measures of this. And I can tell you which areas are worse and better. I can also tell you how much it costs drivers in terms of lost time and lost pain, because I can actually observe how much drivers slow down at a really salient break in roughness. So take, for example, just the Evanston-Chicago border. Roads get a lot rougher when you drive into Chicago. And so with that, you could actually see, because you see how much people slow down, how much they're willing to pay in terms of lost time for a smoother ride. And then the third thing I can do is tell you how well cities are targeting the repaving, because I have for 5 cities what your probability of repaving is over the next 8 months after our measurement. And I can tell you in 4 out of those 5 cities, somewhat surprisingly, New York was the only exception, there is 0 correlation between probability of being repaved and initial roughness. So there appears to be 0 targeting whatsoever of this thing. And that's sort of getting involved in the nitty-gritty of urban government, but it's actually an important function. And it's one that I think we could actually get our cities better, as indeed we can get our police forces to be more functional, and we certainly can get our schools to be more functional. So those are all parts of making cities places that actually people want to live in, and they're part of the sort of long-run economic development strategy that I think is sensible.
So attracting and training talent, that's something that we think a lot about at IHS. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. Is that, though, in cities connected to those knowledge spillovers that you mentioned? Can you talk about that link?
It is. One of the pieces of evidence that we lead us toward the view of knowledge spillovers include what are called human capital externalities and wages. So this is the fact that holding your years of schooling constant, your earnings typically go up by 10% as the share of adults in your college area go up by 10%. So there's a very substantial benefit from working around skilled people. This is also true at the firm level. So having skilled peers at the firm really matters. And indeed, one of the differences between northern Brazilian cities, which are fairly dysfunctional for poor people, and southern Brazilian cities, which are not, more like American cities or more like European cities, is that in northern Brazilian cities, less skilled guys work in sort of very segregated firms, not around highly skilled people, whereas in southern cities, as in the US, there's a lot of integration of skills within a city. It's also true that skills are very predictive of which cities have grown over the last 30 years. I mean, if you look at those colder cities, the Rust Belt cities, like the things that predict why Boston has done better than Detroit, it's just years of schooling, right? Years of schooling basically predict where both of those cities should end up. So that sort of goes along with this notion that it's the skills that complement the density, in part because education teaches you to be a communicator, but also because you just have more information to share the more that you've learned.
So I'd like to bring this part of the conversation to a close by talking about another area of talent in which you are an expert, which is academic talent. So you were telling us just before the call that you are the chair of the department, which means you are overseeing a whole range of hiring and other sorts of personnel decisions. How much did you say you have on your plate right now in terms of retention and various hires?
Well, so I am a middle manager in a large New England not-for-profit organization. That's the right way to understand what being department chair is. And I have we're in the middle of 4 outside senior offers, so those would be tenured, 3 outside junior offers, those would be untenured, but tenure track, and 2 retention battles. So as well as trying to attract, 30 PhD students to try and come here next year. So retaining and attracting talent is very much in my mind. And plus, there's convincing the staff we need them to come in rather than just zooming in. That's another form of attracting talent. But yes, that's very much in my mind.
Yeah. So in fact, the first time that you and I spoke was for an IHS event for graduate students, and we've supported some of your graduate students over the years. So I would love to just hear you think aloud about the importance of an organization like IHS in being able to support not only those students, why supporting academic talent matters, but then also the role that an organization like IHS can play in carving out a space for classical liberal ideas to really thrive in the academy. How do those issues look from where you sit?
So again, I believe very strongly in the IHS mission. That's why I'm here. And I have been very grateful for the events that I've been engaged with. Let me take the first part of your question, which is believing in the value of investing in academic talent. So I do this like with my life. I mean, I spend an enormous amount of my time advising PhD students. I have 18 PhD students that are just finishing up this year, meaning that we had to make sure they got jobs, which means I'm talking to 30 to 40 on a regular basis. So this is a huge amount of my life is investing in their thesis. I think that is in some sense the best investment that I make. And when we're able to use department resources to finance it, I can't think of a better use of their money. They're relatively cheap to support. They're utterly devoted to using the power of economic knowledge to make the world a better place. We occupy a world that is very far from the caricature of a campus of sort of woke political agitators, right? These are people who are trying to figure out how to the students that I just saw this morning. So one was working on as of right zoning in Los Angeles, and did that make a difference for substantial density? Another one was talking about how they can create spaces in Indian factories where women are less likely to be harassed or abused in different ways. So it turns out that women in Indian factories often end up working at the same factory as their husband because he can protect her from various forms of abuse. That's a sign that sort of things are dysfunctional. We have a long track record in this country of actually trying to figure out how to make that work. And often firms have themselves been at the road of that. So if you think about the Lowell Mills, which were pioneers of American industrialization, they were able to attract young women from farms, and they did it in part because those young women were safe. And they figured out how to make that happen. And firms, when conditions are right, do this without any government intervention whatsoever. And then, for example, Yulu Tang, she's a student of mine who will probably be joining LSE next year as an assistant professor, has done some marvelous work on learning in cities, where she looks at Chinese, basically Uber Eats drivers who come to Beijing or Shanghai, and then she's able to look at how good they are doing their job, which is measured by how quickly they're able to get to their customer or to get to the restaurant they're picking it up. And it turns out that if they have a person in their network who has driven the ride before, that's almost as good as having done it yourself before. And that gives you an advantage of joining a location where there's lots of people from your hometown, because you can share information. You can really see the information move. The downside of having lots of people from your hometown is, like, when your hometown is a flood, you all start working at the same time more, and that depresses wages. So I love supporting them. I think that I can't think of a better use, because they're going to do the kind of research that's going to make all of our lives better in the future, all of our governments better in the future. And I think that's great. Now, 2 aspects of IHS are also important, one of which is the network. So the network is important for us, but it's even more important for people who aren't in Cambridge, right? Who aren't in a world in which they're surrounded by, scores of other graduate students in their area. And it's really valuable to be able to sort of connect people across places, even if there wasn't the commitment to classical liberalism. That IHS networking event is just networking power is really powerful and important. But secondly, I think it's really valuable that there is something that networks that has a particular commitment to things that are for me related to the values of John Stuart Mill or the values of Adam Smith, because those values are, I think, the right values, and they're values that are often under attack in many places. Less so in economics than in other disciplines, but even in economics, right? The tide has moved in various ways, and it is less natural for economists to always believe that freedom is an important asset. That's sometimes you give it up, but you only give it up under duress. You only give it up when there's a really good reason to do that. And having just lots of people who have those views end up feeling very cut off in departments where there's not a lot of acceptance of that. And so having a network that actually enables people who believe in the values of classical liberalism to connect with each other, to have those values, to have those values shared and discussed, I just think that has enormous value in the world.
I can't think of a better place to end this part of the conversation on. So I'd like for everybody in the audience to join me in giving Professor Glaeser a virtual round of applause. Thank you, Ed. What a fantastic conversation. So we're going to move to questions in just a moment. And if you haven't submitted your question yet, there is still time. You can just click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will try to get to as many as we can. But first, I just want to emphasize something that Ed said just now, which is that now more than ever, the work that organizations like IHS is doing is essential for helping classical liberal scholars do their best work and to get that work out into the world so that it can make a real difference. And that's what we do day in and day out. And so that's why we are so grateful for those of you who are here and have supported IHS over the years. We can only do what we do thanks to your generosity. And so I just want to say once again, thank you. All right, so we have a great crop of questions. And for the first one, I want to go to a question submitted by another Ed that says, for 7 years, I chaired the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. I'm not a fan of rent controls, but the idea seems to be spreading. How should we think about rent controls?
That's a great question. So I teach two classes. I teach an economics of cities class, and I teach an intermediate micro class, where in my intermediate micro class, I sort of have a very strong line that I'm trying to convince them that the tools of mathematical economics are valuable. And I make a very clear line that I'm not going to say any policy is good or bad, with one exception, and it's rent control. So it is interesting that economists who for decades, fell over each other, coming up with new reasons to hate rent control, have become much more quiet on this than they had in the past. And if we think about the reasons not to like rent control, so the classic Friedman-Stigler reason is just you have too little supply of housing, right? If you don't allow landlords to charge market rates, units get pulled off the market, or new rental housing doesn't get built. There is the depreciation problem. Right. So if you don't allow people who invest in their units to earn more money, they're not going to invest in their units. Right. I certainly remember, grand dams of New York City real estate, which had fallen to seed in the 1970s after decades of rent control. And you really see, this is from the work of David Otter and Parag Pathak, when Cambridge has to get rid of rent control, it's not just that the buildings that are rent control get better, the whole neighborhood gets better, right? The whole neighborhood that's around those things get better. So there appears to be some spillovers on this. 3, if you're giving out a whole bunch of units that are below market rents, people are going to waste a whole lot of time trying to get those units, right? In some sense, a price mechanism could occur. It's just going to be a very wasteful one. 4, and this is where I've been engaged in doing scholarship on, you have units that are misallocated. You have units that are misallocated both in a static sense, because you aren't using the pricing mechanism to ration the units to the person who values the most, but also you're telling people that they get this great deal on housing if they stay in the housing, but not if they get rid of it. And so people will stay in the housing far longer than they want to. And 5, in most cases, it's not even remotely obvious if this is good from an equity perspective. The classic work of D. Gale Johnson from the 1950s found that the typical renter in New York was actually richer than the typical landlord. When I remember, having friends were PhD students at MIT in the 1980s, and they would be renting from, immigrant entrepreneurs who ran triple deckers. And the idea that there was anything comparable at their lifetime earnings of the protected renter who was going to go on to be a finance professor in Stanford, and the immigrant entrepreneur, right? You're redistributing from the poor to the rich. So for all these reasons, rent control is problematic, but you can see why it's politically popular any place that you have a lot of renters, because they think it's a great idea, and it feels like it's the demand for it occurs just because we have rising housing prices. And instead of understanding the right way to fight rising housing prices to make it easier and easier to build housing, the response instead is to say, oh, why don't we just try and fix the market in some way that protects people? It's always going to be a politically attractive intervention, and it's almost always a mistake. I say almost always because I have slightly more sympathy for the original imposition of rent control during World War II, where there's a complicated thing in terms of collective contribution, many people giving their lives to their country. And there's a complicated element in psychology there that, things that feel like it's price gouging or windfalls may be difficult for the psyche of other people. So I don't mean to say that I'm endorsing it, but because it really is about the psychology of a nation, not about economics, I'm not going to condemn it in the same way that I would post-war rent control.
So speaking of government interventions, let's go to the next question, which says, you mentioned Texas cities as good examples of urban growth. I'm curious how you'd think about their notoriously low density and car-dependent infrastructure. How much of that is the result of government interventions, and how much of that is actual market demand for that kind of car-centric living?
I think it's both. So look, I mean, the average commute, these numbers are a little bit old, but the average commute by car is something like 24, 25 minutes. The average commute by public transit is something like 50 minutes, right? Americans value their time, and car-based living tends to be less time intensive. The reason for that is primarily the time fixed cost involved in public transit. So anytime you're taking a train, taking a bus, you got to get to the stop. You got to wait for the thing to show up. Now, maybe the apps have made that slightly better, and then you've got to go from the eventual place that it drops you off to where you're going. That, in my estimates, again, these are maybe 20 years old, was about a 15 to 20 minute fixed cost for the typical ride. So no matter how far you were going on the public transit, you were spending 15 to 20 minutes just dealing with access to it. That's an incredible burden for public transit to bear relative to a car, which is point to point. And of course, the car has remade America's cities. America's new cities, not just Texas, Arizona, all of the new spaces tend to be much lower density, in part because cars enable low density living. And in some sense, they often require low density living. Now, I think a lot of that would have happened without any government stuff at all. But we're sure as heck not making it better with public policies which tilt towards car ownership. So let me give you the three biggies that I think are really problematic. One of which is just the fact that we use general tax revenues to subsidize highways, right? We used to actually subsidize highways, but we used to pay for the gas, use the gas tax to pay for the highway trust fund. We do not anymore. There's no reason why ordinary American taxpayers should be funding people to drive on highways. Highways should be paying for themselves. In fact, pretty much all transportation systems, except maybe some very targeted bus systems that are effective for very poor people, should be self-sufficient financially and should be paying for themselves. There are many good reasons for them. Many of them are actually included in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations itself, where he's actually a big fan of user fee financing for transportation infrastructure. Secondly, home mortgage interest deduction. Okay, we have fetishized home mortgages in this country. I happen to be a homeowner myself. I don't think that that's a bad decision in many cases, but there's no reason the government should have its thumb on the scale. And there's such a strong correlation between ownership type and structure type that when you're telling Americans they should all be homeowners, you're pushing them out of urban apartments into suburban homes, and you're again encouraging lower density living. And third, of course, there is the difficulty with big city school systems, that so many Americans feel like they need to leave big cities to get those to get different schools, and that's also going on. And there's no reason intrinsically why big cities have to have bad schools. Not like Paris has bad schools. Paris has great schools. Not like London has bad schools, right? It's particularly to the way that our public sector has worked schools. And quite honestly, it would be better either if we went to something like a pure voucher system where people could go to school anywhere. We didn't have to link where you could live, or if you chose a more statist approach and actually made sure that we had reasonable school quality everywhere, that would do it too. But either way would get rid of this tremendous spatial distortion. So I think a lot of Texas would look like the way that it does now, even without public policies. But we've got public policies that certainly make it worse.
So Walter mentions that he has visited a city in China that has a population that's been growing very quickly, and they've provided housing by building clusters of identical 30-story residential towers as far as the eye can see in every direction. These clusters are called districts and are intended to contain some services and access to public transportation. And Walter wants to know what you think of that kind of model.
So there are many issues with the Chinese urban model, but they are relatively low cost providers of urban space, and I think there's a lot to ask about why American housing productivity has gone in the wrong direction, and I will return to that in a second. Two, I will say something else positive about something that looks like this model, which is one of my favorite transit models is Hong Kong's MTR, which funds its highways, funds its subways by building skyscrapers on top of the highway. Now, this is not subsidized, right? It's cross subsidization between two different functions, but that's a very nice model. It doesn't involve some large public like design system that does this. It just naturally comes up because people are willing to pay for proximity to the to the subway. Now, China has provided affordability by building a lot, at least outside of its core tier 1 cities. It has massively overbuilt many of them, right, because of screwed up political incentives. And this is something that is a huge challenge for China politically right now. I mean, this is something that I wrote about a long time ago called the real estate boom with Chinese characteristics, which chronicled the enormous amount of overbuilding that was going on, in part because the city governments are led by people who want to make their GDP seem higher than it is. And when you build housing and don't sell it, you just look like you've done a lot of productive things, even though you haven't. The difference between China and the US is if you build a lot of homes and aren't able to sell them in the US, then you go into bankruptcy. Your creditors take you over. In China, state-related lenders give forbearance to state-related builders, and the whole thing just persists. So I admire Chinese efficiency as I do the efficiency of Singapore, the efficiency of South Korea. There's a lot to like about East Asian cities, but if I were choosing between them, I see, I see no problems with most of the Korean model, but the Chinese model just has way too little freedom and way too little individual choice for anything that I'm going to be remotely comfortable with.
So we have time for one more question. And with this one, I'd love for you to look into your crystal ball and tell us what you think about the way that this might develop. How will the rise of remote work change the American city?
Well, it's a huge challenge for the American office market right now. And it highlights the problem of having built massive clusters of offices without interspersed residential space. Because one of the reasons why it's so hard to get people to go into their offices is that it's still a 50-minute commute, right? So they work in downtown New York, their home is in Connecticut or in New Jersey, and this ends up being a disaster for them in terms of time loss. And if they don't have to do this, they don't want to do this, totally understandably. If we had just many more residential apartments interspersed, this would be less of an issue because people wouldn't be facing these very long commutes. I don't see a world in which office prices don't tumble very significantly. I'm enough of someone with faith in markets to believe there will come a price at which these units will be occupied, but it's going to be a lot lower than the current price. But I think in the long run, cities are going to be fine. I don't think this is I think fundamentally we still learn more face-to-face. Certainly anyone who tried the Zoom education or the Zoom advising thing, it was fairly disastrous. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests the whole learning stuff just isn't the same for online workers. And I think it's particularly tragic that younger Americans think that they want a remote job because they're the people who actually need to be around people to actually learn how to be good more than anyone else does. There's some great work by Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington, two former students of ours, who show they look at sort of a natural experiment where they send call center workers home, and the call center workers are just as productive in terms of a static sense, in terms of making calls, that they are in the office, but their probability of being promoted drops by 50%. A similar fact was found earlier with Chinese call center workers by Nick Bloom, who's a great economist at Stanford. So the sort of learning channel gets turned off, and I think that's particularly tragic. And I think in the long run, that is just so valuable that cities recover on that. Of course, they need partially, one of the things they need to recover is they need to be places where people want to live. And this is why, again, as much as my instincts may be libertarian, I think fundamentally they need to take the job of managing urban spaces seriously, which means making sure the cops are working well, making sure the roads are working well, making sure it's easy to open a new business. And I'm not averse to a little bit of urban effort around making sure the parks are pleasant, making sure there's some creativity in terms of just the joys of urban life. So I think cities will be okay, but it's going to take some work, especially in the places that were the superstars beforehand. But precisely because they're so tech intensive, they were hit by Zoom so much. And on top of this, they have highly progressive city councilors that think it's okay to have open air fentanyl markets in prime downtown areas. So Seattle, I think, is already clawing its way back. San Francisco still has some work left to do. But in the long run, I'm bullish even on San Francisco.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for this part of the conversation. As Emily mentioned at the beginning of the call, today was just the first in an ongoing series of these virtual conversations. And so I want to extend an invitation to everyone in the audience to join us for our next conversation in just a little over a month from now on March 26th, where we will be diving into corporate governance and free markets. So we'll be asking questions like, what is the role and responsibility of business in society? What are the implications of some of those acronyms that we've heard about, DEI and ESG? We will be joined by Siri Turgeson, who is the professor and associate dean at Florida Atlantic University. She's a longtime friend of IHS. She'll be leading that conversation, and we hope that everyone joins us for that. So invitations will be coming soon. And lastly, just want to extend one more note of gratitude to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Thank you for what you do to advance a free and open society. We'll see you very soon.